just indicating here is some major inputs from volume 1 and volume 2. But our main area of concern here is how part 1 turns into part 2. So Marx carries over the variable of organic composition of capital into his analysis in part 2. He carries over the turnover of capital into part 2. But at the very beginning of part 2, he denies, or if you like, limits the scope of his solution to these problems by saying that the rate of surplus value will not change. He says this, he justifies this in terms of he's looking at the system as though it's the capital within one country, and all the workers within one country will be exploited to the same degree. There's a tendency to convergence, he believes, of workers in one country, because the workers in one sector are more exploited than in another sector or one region, one might say, then they will move. They will move from that region to one where they can get better pay. So there's a tendency, he believes, to the equalization of the rate of surplus value. Okay. So what we are left with is a partial solution in part 2 against the premises that Marx himself posed in part 1. And furthermore, when we move from part 2 into part 3, what part 2 does is it moves from the individual to the social totality. So Marx defines a social totality as capitalism in one country, basically. And he aggregates and looks at the laws of motion of the totality. And I'll explain how he does that in a minute. But that totality itself has got movement. And it's in part 3 that Marx brings in the totality of movement. And the totality of movement is what he calls the tendency of the rate of profit to fall. So in part 2, a general rate of profit is formed. And in part 3, he considers explicitly the movement of that general rate of profit. And the underlying thread going through all of these for Marx is the tendency of the organic composition of capital to rise. In other words, as social labor becomes more productive, then proportionately speaking, more and more capital is invested in the machines and the raw materials, and proportionately less and less is invested in buying labor power. And that is because of the increase in social productivity. But what Marx is interested in doing is reaching a point of development of a contradiction which reaches its climax in part 3. And what the climax is that as capital gets labor to become more productive, as the organic composition of capital rises, the very basis in relative terms for making profit reduces. And at a certain point, this reduction in relative terms becomes absolute. And that's the outbreak of crisis. The rate of profit will fall to a certain point where any new investment does not increase the rate of profit. And Marx explains this very well, I think, in part 3. However, what Marx also says in part 3 is that there are countervailing tendencies to the decline in the rate of profit. And here you will recall he talks about Negroes and coolies in the colonies as being a mechanism of increasing the rate of profit and therefore offsetting the tendency of the overall rate of profit to fall. But having raised it, he also very quickly dismisses investigating it at this level of abstraction. He says it's something to do with competition. Okay, so the criticism is basically Marx should have not blocked the gap here because it clearly is a major factor in the dynamic of the system overall, and the analysis should have included the rate of surplus value and its differential rates as part of the transformation in part 2. What happens here is purely quantitative. Marx is really only, I've been giving you numbers. Marx is looking at different rates of profit and how different rates of surplus value, I beg your pardon, and how they affect the rate of profit. But when we get to here, we can see that this is not just quantitative, it's very qualitative and speaks to the nature of the scope of the analysis and the context of what is the system overall. So I'm going to return to this at the end. So in part 2, Marx does not have a differentiation in the rate of surplus value. The main variable, if you like, is differences in organic composition of capital. That the scope of what he's considering is capitalism in one country, basically. So, and this is an example of Marx's solution, chapter 9, the famous chapter where the transformation takes place. And the left-hand side, this first table, I'm going to show you 2 tables. This is before the transformation, where Marx explains quite rightly on the assumptions which he's now limited and working to. His main issue is how the proportion of constant capital to variable capital varies from one sector to another. So he's basing this on differences in organic composition of capital according to the technical character and the degree of industrialization of different industrial sectors. So we have, for example, down here, a sector which is highly industrialized. There's a very high proportion of constant capital to variable capital, okay? Whereas by contrast, we can see this sector here, although there's more constant capital invested in by the total capital advance, it's not that much more than the variable capital, okay? Now, why is Marx setting this up? Because he wants to look at the characteristics of surplus value production becoming profit under this condition of different organic compositions of capital. So what Marx tells us is that the rate of surplus value is the same in all these sectors. Workers are being exploited to the same degree. They're getting paid the same amount of money and they're producing the same value per worker in each sector. But because fewer workers are employed in some sectors than others, notice that these all add up to 100. So the amount of variable capital is kind of like an index or a proxy, if you like, to the number of workers employed. And where there's more workers employed at the same rate of surplus value, they're going to produce more surplus value than the sectors where there's fewer workers employed, but they're exploited to the same degree, are going to produce less surplus value than where there's a lot of workers, okay? Now, untransformed, what this would give rise to is distinct rates of profit in the sectors. So surplus value of 5 over a capital total capital advance of 100 is going to give us 5%. By contrast, a surplus value of 40 against an original investment of 100 again will give us a rate of profit of 40%. Okay. Now, Marx does bring in the distinction, which I kind of labored early on, but you can begin to see why it was necessary to get a decent grasp of it. And this left-hand column is the total capital advanced, which is a greater amount than the amount of capital used up in any given year in the production of the commodities. So Marx gives us a further finesse, if you like, of the setup of this issue, where he points out that we can have a constant capital in the commodities of 50, a variable capital of 20, a surplus value of 20. That's 50 plus 20 plus 20. That will be the simple value of the commodities. So these commodities have a value of 90, but they cost 70. They cost the 20 here and the 50 here. He could have done with another column, couldn't he? Right? Just to make that clear. Right. So basically, no trickery so far. You still got your eye on the ball. Under which cup will it eventually appear? We don't quite yet know. But you can see on these assumptions that the surplus value is different in each sector. The amount of total capital advance is the same in each sector. Therefore, it must give rise, under the conditions of our assumptions, that the rate of profit is different by sector. The sectors which employ more workers producing more surplus value are going to have higher rates of profit than those with fewer workers producing less surplus value. Now, this is, if you like, an expression of the law of value without modification. So what Marx does is he says, well, it's not quite like that. We have to modify it. It's important before we come to the next step to see what his reasoning is. So here he has a total of all the capitals invested in different sectors. And you'll see very quickly, this adds up to 500. There's 100 in each sector, 5 sectors. That's a total capital advance of 500, okay? But if you take the average across the whole of the system, this would